Apologies, thank you. So nice to meet you all. Thank you for attending. I will start by introducing MD EASM as a product, and then Ajay will take over and go through some of the new features. If you would like to understand a more detailed, in-depth version of EASM as a product, then please feel free to watch an earlier webinar. This presentation is to show you some of the new features, but as I stated, I will be going over EASM just as an overview, just to start with. So, EASM. We are a product with a unique perspective. One way to look at us is, remember, we are an outside-in view of an attack surface. Now, that view is unique because a lot of the products you see today tend to be the inside-out perspective and give you a view which is fairly one-sided. Everything we see from EASM raises the risk profile because obviously we see things as an attacker would see it. So things you may feel may be not so much of a risk because you can see them internally. The moment you can see them from an attacker's perspective, that risk profile becomes much more real and much more relevant. So as you can see on the slide here today, these are some of the modern day challenges which EASM can tackle. And just a few highlights and use cases from this scenario, things like human error. You may have an infrastructure which you feel is very well protected, and you may even feel you can't see it from the internet. COVID was a very good example of this, when you had developers setting up new infrastructure so they could help themselves when they're working from home, and they had to move that infrastructure very, very quickly. These sort of errors can lead to vulnerabilities, which attackers from an EASM perspective would be able to see. So EASM and modern day challenges, the moving and evolving of that infrastructure, are things which we aim to tackle. So I'll start off with, I guess, the three main sections of EASM. As you can see on the screen here, we have discover, prioritize, and secure. EASM is a product. We split into these three phases for the sake of this presentation. There's a lot that goes into each of these three sections, but just to help you break down and understand the process before we go into the new tasks, it's important to understand these three separate phases. So the first phase I wanted to just briefly overview is the discovery process. So EASM and even the infrastructure that sits behind it, we're constantly scanning across the internet. What becomes relevant and important for EASM and to you as an organization is obviously everything we're scanning that is relevant to you. Now, in order for us to do that, we need to understand certain what we call seed information. Now, that seed information allows us to start validating and pulling in assets, which things like our sensors and crawlers can go out on the internet. And assets, I refer to things like your domains, your hosts, your IP addresses, your SSL certificates. We can pull all this information in and we can start trying to understand how it's behaving. Now, this discovery process is very important because it is not a static list. We don't just do this once and then we try and go through all the assets we have discovered. We do this on a continuous weekly basis. We're always trying to understand how your infrastructure is evolving, how it's changing, and new infrastructure that might be showing up and popping up all across your attack surface. So it's a really, really important factor and thing to consider when you're looking at your attack surface management. And EASM and its discovery process handles this whole process for you. The second section is the prioritization. So prioritizing your vulnerabilities. Now, EASM has done its discovery. It understands what the organization or what you own, and now it is going to try and understand the risk impact and the risk factors associated with those assets. So now we've discovered things, we've pulled it all in to a container, which we can now start scanning and reviewing and actually showing you the information which is relevant to you. Now, what this allows you to do is start understanding things like what web components, even what versions you have running, any deprecated versions and things that may need fixing. And this is obviously something which we scan outside of a firewall, right? So everything we're looking at and we're scanning and reviewing and showing to you is things which you can see out on the open internet And also this exposure is what an attacker can see. So the risk profile, the vulnerabilities, and the exposure itself is all extremely relevant and can help you understand what you need to fix on your attack surface. And then the third and final section is the secure section. So what we're now trying to do, we've discovered your assets, we've now prioritized and we've seen those vulnerabilities. And now we're attempting to help you, or when you fix something, you will actually see that reflect back in the product itself. So because EASM is out on the internet and it is agentless, to scan this infrastructure or to scan your entities, you don't have to install anything. So it's pretty much the start of a button. You put your seeds in and we can go out and understand this infrastructure relates to you. The moment you fix something, because we're continuously scanning and discovering, that should reflect back in all of the findings within EASM. So that means all those gaps, all those fixes are all going to be shown in near real time in the way that you fix something. The next time we scan it, we can reflect that fix and then we can make sure it disappears and that fix is now no longer shown in any of the risk profiles across EASM. So the data collection. The key thing here, as I mentioned already, is the outside in perspective. Most enterprises have one view and that's the inside out. The attack surface is so dynamic, it's constantly changing, new infrastructure, new cloud environments, you have new marketing departments spinning up new infrastructure. You may even have new infrastructure as you acquire different businesses. So you can imagine this ever-changing, dynamic, growing attack surface is key to making sure you can keep tabs wherever possible. I believe now, gone are the days where you can have one person looking after infrastructure and it is very much more static. Those things are now definitely in the past, and we can now have to make sure that we can move with that ever-growing infrastructure. So typically, we see things through the eye of an attacker, and I've mentioned that a few times already, but it's an important factor to consider. So most platforms operate from a known good inside of you, as I mentioned before. We are actually physically showing you things which you can see from an attacker's perspective. So real world threat actors would target and use these specific methods. And these are methods which we can see within EASM, and we can highlight those risks through these methods as well. So how it works, we have web crawlers, very sophisticated bots, effectively, that are going around across the internet and clicking as a real human does. As we click and we use these active and passive sensors, we can then start pulling in a huge amount of data and showing you how everything is reacting and interacting with us as a product. Now, these applications are so dynamic, they're always changing. It's very important to understand that we are interacting with these effectively and as a real user would. And then we can reflect that data back to you as a user of EASM. So let's take it from a user perspective. As you're clicking through the internet, you have a user who then loads a page, and then the whole browser and the DOM is captured. As we capture this, you can imagine we have dependent requests, which is effectively every single get and post that happens on a page. We can collect all the cookie information, headers, links, and all the sequences of how a page was loaded. Now, all this information helps to then build a picture and help you understand how your attack surface is performing and how people are potentially engaging with it. And we can also then start building signatures on top of this information. So once we've collected all this information and we do go down to that DOM level, we can help you to understand vulnerabilities and issues through our global internet data sets. And here is a big picture of everything. So on our left-hand side, you see across the internet, we have all our different internet data collectors, huge amount of data going into what we call a global inventory. And then this is where EASM starts to manage and then point things towards your organization. So as you can see on that left-hand side, we're collecting huge amount of data. The seeds are then what direct it and make sure that it's relevant to you as an organization. And then we show you everything in EASM on that right-hand side across all of those different data sets, which is related to your organization. So how does this work? So as a part of the discovery mechanism, we have this idea of this chaining process. So you can imagine you have a domain seed, which has a host, which may have several hosts in some instances, and could have several different IP addresses and IP blocks. That IP blocks could have further IP addresses, which then link to further hosts. And then you can start to see these different mechanisms and this infrastructure chaining happening. The algorithm goes out and has been built in a way to make sure that we can understand that where we go down this chain is relevant to your organization. And that is an important factor to consider. We have this idea and this process of making sure you understand that these are approved assets, so things we confidently say are related to your organization. And then we have various different other stages as well, things like candidates or even dependencies. So dependencies could be organizations or websites or assets which your infrastructure is reliant on, and we can see those dependencies connected to your infrastructure. So you may not own it, but it's important that you understand and can understand how it interacts with your organization. And that being said, I know it was a very brief interview and introduction. I will now pass on to Ajay to take over.
Hello. Thanks, Jamil. As we looked at EASM as a product, it's constantly evolving, and we are constantly upgrading our product as well to meet customer needs and make it better and better as we go. So today we'll just talk about some of these updates that have happened in the first half of 2023, or you can say within the past 1 year. Since EASM has been launched. And we will go in detail in some of these things that are relevant to EASM as a solution to an enterprise. So some of the things, basic updates that we have done over the year is region availability. When EASM was launched, it was launched in around 6 regions globally. We have expanded that now to cover a lot of EMEA regions as well as Canada, which was primarily needed by the European customers who have data restrictions to not leave the continent. So we have now quite a few regions where EASM can be easily available and deployed in their own region. So that's one. We also are compliant with the executive order for Cyber EO that was released or published by the White House in 2021, where software vendors, cloud service providers wanted to have more security enhancement and supply chain integrity for software companies, and I think that's one of the good things that our product is compliant. As Jamil was talking about, coming back to EASM as a product, how the discovery of digital assets is so important to show into a workspace what digital assets are really the ones that belong to you. And to come up with that algorithm that keeps constantly evolving, and we always keep making upgrades, and these are just some of the notable upgrades of the many that happen, where some private IP exclusion so that we don't show any IP addresses in the private IP space. Wildcards that normally make your workspace too bulky, excluding them kind of gives a more narrower and a more accurate view of your assets. Similarly, enhancing how the stale host assets look. These are some of the discovery upgrades made, and we're looking at it. Some dashboards and insights is another thing that has been used by a lot of people that use EASM, because that readily gives them intelligence that they need for whether they're looking for vulnerabilities, whether they're looking for cloud assets, whether they're looking for certain CVSS related data, all of that. And now we kind of put the timestamp to show how the data has changed, so that if any changes happen, it shows our refresh timelines as well, and better usability across the different charts. And we will go in detail with the dashboards as well. Same thing with CVSS score. CVSS score has been an important parameter by vulnerability management teams for a long time. We have just improved how we see that for digital assets, where we can see both the CVSS 2.0 and 3 scores together for each of the assets where we have that data, and that makes it nice for analysts to look at that data on a single UI screen, and that kind of helps. So that's about it. Let's go into details in some of the other things like the data connector or the APIs or bulk updates that we have. And then we can go and explain some of those things. So one of the most important feature or tools that we have today with EASM is this integration with different Azure services or different Azure tools, mainly Azure Log Analytics and Azure Data Explorer. This enables customers to take EASM data and then integrate into Log Analytics and thereby into Sentinel to do a SIM integration. What that means is customers can now sync their EASM data and then be able to scale with their hunting, with their creation of custom dashboards, with the creation of reporting, mixing that data and with their other sources from internal data sources, and then correlate the data and come up with unique analytic rules that are necessary for the security teams to make decisions. By giving this in-house inside the product, it makes very easy of setup, and all you have to do and just enable the connection that you want to use, and then you will be able to do that, create workbooks, create playbooks, create automations, and also be able to put EASM data into your workflow that you have. If you're a Sentinel customer, or if you're a Kusto customer, you can handle large volumes of data because some of the EASM workspaces can be large, and customers normally want a way to analyze that data, do hunting, write complex queries to get the data they want. And this kind of enables out of the box. And that is one of the key features, I think, that came out in 2023 for EASM that a lot of customers use and is of good value. Some of the custom visualizations that are possible, this is just an example of what we could do. From the standard dashboards that are in the product, if you want to take that, use Azure Data Explorer or use Log Analytics and Sentinel and do custom visualizations, track data. This is just an example showing how you could do that. Power BI is a great visualization tool that a lot of customers use, and then Azure Data Explorer kind of becomes that conduit that helps into helping customers to build their visualizations, building their reporting, building that workflow. And this is just an example to show how they can. Similarly, here's another example that explains a different visualization, asset trending, or basically looking at your workspace over a period of time is of great value. And this can be achieved through the data connector and using either Azure workbooks through Log Analytics or using Kusto dashboards or Power BI through the Azure Data Explorer. This is just showing how you can track either your workspace, the whole external attack surface, or some of the vulnerabilities over time. As we go forward, this was one of a more popular ask that we included in EASM, is the ability to simply save the searches. As such, it sounds pretty simple, and it is every time analysts work into EASM and they can come up with a very complex query or even a very simple query, and you can save it if it is something that you do on a daily basis, or a security team works on a daily basis. So then you can look at all these saved queries, and you don't have to recreate those queries. So you don't have to. So you can, with all these fields that we have available, where you can write a query to surface your assets, once you know this is a query good enough, you can save it and then keep using it on a long-term basis, and then share it among the users as well, among your team that uses the same EASM workspace. That's a very handy feature that comes in hand a lot of times.
There's another thing here, Ajay, sorry, if I could just jump in there. So on the safe searches, in terms of the automation, if anyone is trying to leverage the API or even do something like logic apps, this allows you to actually call any of your saved searches, making that automation process a lot easier. So if you ever wanted to change a saved search or change any of your queries or update, that level of automation can now be handled as well through the API or something like logic apps.
Right, rather than doing the actual query via the API. Because normally there are two facets to a security team, where you have your security analysts that work in the business, in the UI, in the product, do the hunting, do the searching, create the rules, and then you have your technical resources that work with the API to build any automations or workflows. So giving them the name of the safe query rather than asking them to create a filter with a few parameters, I think is a lot easier. And that's a fair point, Jamil. That's a great point. And that kind of facilitates that, yes. The next feature is about labels. So labels are the most important thing right now in EASM, because EASM, if you want to organize your assets, if you want to categorize your assets, then labels is how you do it. I mean, when you look at your, when the discovery is completed, you have a workspace with a bunch of assets. Now, the process of managing that workspace can be done, and labels is the tool to do it. You can categorize your assets based on ownership. It's owned by a certain organization within your company, or by brands, or you can organize you can add labels, and labels is just a free text label that you can create, free form text that you can create, and it can be anything you want. So ideally, as an enterprise grows in their EASM program, they have all kinds of labels where they have assets categorized by the brands, the different brands that their company owns, by different organizations, by different regions in the globe where they are hosted, and probably define ownership that way, or even you can say through vulnerabilities that you're tracking, or through specific safe queries that are most valuable for the security team to monitor. So labels is the tool that how you do all of this. And then this same labels this data is part of the asset data that gets percolated into data connector, into log analytics, where you can visualize that data. So for example, if you have brands and say you have labeled all your assets according to your brands, then you can create a chart, an insight showing exactly which brand has how many assets or which assets, or for a particular brand, what kind of technologies are being used for that business. And that can be a report, that can be a chart, a dashboard in Azure Workbooks in Power BI. Or you can have some kind of an automation to alert certain vulnerabilities, like if you're monitoring for expired SSL certs or open ports, you can label them, and anytime you see something new, you can get alerted based on that label. So there are tons of usage for labels. You can query within the workspace using the labels as well. So you can clearly find the digital assets you want to see. The next thing is that goes along with the labels is the feature that we introduced was this year was to do bulk updates on your inventory. When the product was first launched, we only were able to update at a given time the first page of your digital assets that were shown. Now you can do a lot more. You can do bulk updates. So you can do some of those tasks in a way where you can say, you can query, give me all approved inventory that matches certain criteria, and then apply certain label or change the status of that because you think this is not something I care about, and you can change them to a different status, apply a label, and all of that can be one task. And we have something called like a task manager. The task manager is basically a tool that tracks, monitors your bulk updates. So you can do any updates like it's shown here, modified assets. You can add labels, remove labels, change the state of the asset. And then when you hit update, it will go and run that job in an asynchronous way. I don't have a screenshot showing that, but you can see that in Azure notifications that the job is running and when it's completed. The task manager also gives you a list of all the jobs that have been run that you can look at. So you can then go into the task manager as we have here on the left pane, along with labels, billable assets, data connections, and task manager. So we have task manager there. You can go in there and look at a list of jobs that have run, that have completed, that have, or even failed for some reason. So you kind of get accountability, and you get this option of doing it at a scale. The same thing can also be done or automated using the API. But doing this, having this feature within the UI is of a great importance because it kind of simplifies the job of the security analysts who are looking at this, who want to organize, who want to categorize things. One of the other smaller updates, as we talked about, was how we showed the CVSS scores along with the CVEs. So when we have these digital assets or web pages or hosts where we have the CVSS scores for the different CVEs that are detected, we kind of had the observations tab here to show both CVSS2 and CVSS3 together, as well as what type of detection it was. That kind of helps a unified view, especially for vulnerability management tools who look at this as a parameter in their assessment. As we talked about EASM, we kind of talked about everything that we can do within the EASM user experience within the product, within the Azure portal. And our goal has always been that everything we can do within the UI, it should be supported by using the API, and even more to do this at a scale. And that is where today the MD EASM API is expanded to a point where you can do all functions automated, create a workflow, scripted using the API that pushes whether you want to search data, whether you want to update data, whether you want to look at the jobs that update jobs were submitted, look at the status of them, create discovery groups. You can have a vendor with multiple workspaces and who want to automate creation of discovery groups and some of the workflows. And all of that, the API, there's an API endpoint available to be used, which is part of the Azure API infrastructure, which requires OAuth 2.2 authentication as a standard. We also have the APIs for our insights, our dashboards that you see in the product, which is kind of key because a lot of customers say you're showing all these high and medium vulnerabilities, and I want to be alerted every time there's a new one, every time I see a new one. You can achieve that using the API. There's a question about billing. How much does it cost? Can I monitor the billing so that it doesn't go out of hand? So there is an API for that as well, where you can pull in that data, put some logic around it to monitor it. So basically, we have an API for each report that you see within the product. Same thing with. Go ahead.
So one other thing I wanted to say here, just from a higher level, I guess, is the API. Everything you do through the UI is available through the API. So the API is very rich. There's a lot of functionality through that API, and equally so the SDK today. So if anyone is using the UI and hasn't used the API, just see it as any functionality you can do in the UI can effectively be done in the API as well.
Correct. The other thing that we also introduced was the Python SDK for EASM, which is part of the Azure SDK. If you go to pypy.org, you will easily find the documentation for the EASM SDK, as well as some examples as well. The pypy.org website has a few sample code as well that shows how you can use if your preference. In security world, Python is widely used as a programming language to do scripting. So one of our first languages that we have supported today is Python. As we look into the future, we will bring in other languages as well. Right now, we have an SDK, Python SDK for EASM. And the pypy.org does have a few examples. So it kind of helps because it will kind of solve for some of the authentication pieces that you don't have to code for how to do OAuth 2.0. It has inbuilt support for that. So you don't have to worry about coding for that, or how to do pagination. So there's inbuilt support in the SDK that makes scripting a lot more easier. So all you have to worry about the logic that you want to build around the API or the SDK. So definitely two great tools to scale usage of EASM.
And one other thing I'd like to highlight there as well is just obviously we have the API, you have the SDK, so you can leverage things like logic apps now to make sure you call our API and build that natural workflow. So logic apps is a really good aid in terms of the automation piece behind EASM.
Yes. And that's what brings us back to a GitHub resource. The customer experience engineering team that supports EASM is also hosting a public GitHub resource, a repo called MDEASM-solutions. It's a public repo which sits under Azure, and you should be able to find it in GitHub pretty easily. This is a great a resource that we built because we are publishing a few solutions out here that help vendors, customers, users to readily use some of our solutions, but also show how to automate certain workflows or how to attain certain use cases, certain integrations that are valuable for EASM, but also can be readily be used or modified by customers. Some of the things that we have today is the API Postman collection, a simple Postman collection that shows how to use the API. Postman is a pretty popular tool to work with APIs, REST APIs, and so we have a collection that helps with that. Inventory queries. So we are starting to add a lot of research or threat hunting or asset queries that are valuable to customers, meaning sometimes we get questions like, how do we filter this? How do I find login pages in my EASM workspaces? How do I find park domains? How do I find hosts with certain CVSS score or certain web component? How do I write that filter? So customers who are new to EASM, there might be a learning curve in looking at, okay, what are the details available? What are these attributes? How do I query? So we have some sample queries that we keep adding in that inventory query so that customers can just copy paste that in the UI or the API, to search the workspace. Similarly, Jupyter Notebooks is also another tool that is pretty popular to work with APIs if you wanted to visualize data, analyze data, combine a few different APIs and look at data first and see how that analyze a few things. And you can definitely do that. So we have a couple of examples that show that. In this presentation, we looked at a couple of Kusto dashboards when we were looking at the data connector piece. Here in GitHub, we have an actual Azure workbook sample that customers can deploy readily and use it, so which is based on log analytics, as well as it has compatibility with Azure Data Explorer. But it's a ready workbook, a sample workbook that shows all asset data, a few sample charts that customers can take in, and then they can modify to add more custom use cases they want to see. Helps jumpstart. The last piece, the folder here is automation. As Jamil talked a few times, that in Azure, you can achieve automation very easily through low code using Azure Logic Apps, which is the go-to tool to build automations, small integrations, which require minimum or less coding and scripting. So these automations are some of the automations that we have published as of today. One of them is a ServiceNow integration that pushes or creates incidents from EASM into ServiceNow and brings back the ticket number so that you can reference that in EASM. Doing alerts, if you want to create alerts using certain queries by email, or you want to do the same bulk updates, but you want to automate that to do it on a daily basis for any new assets that are discovered, then you can use the asset management tool. Or you want to download all your assets, say, into a storage place and then move it to some internal resource. You can do, there's an asset download. Vulnerability management is a very important use case that goes hand in hand with EASM. EASM complements the vulnerability management solution. EASM is looking outside in, from the internet into enterprise. And vulnerability management is basically based on agent base that is running across all your enterprise digital assets. So they kind of go hand in hand, where EASM supplements all the externally discovered internet exposed assets and passes that data into vulnerability management solution of your choice, and then vulnerability management scans in a more detailed way and gives a comprehensive report. Together, that data gives a lot of confidence to vulnerability management users, analysts to make decisions, remediations. So we have a couple of examples with a couple of popular vulnerability management tools. This is a resource to be monitored. We keep adding more solutions over the period of time. And that's about it. I'm going to hand it back to Jamil to talk about a bit about insights and dashboards before we conclude this presentation. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So so there's only two more slides, and then we'll try and answer some questions. So the thing I wanted to highlight just before we get to the Q&A is the dashboard. So this isn't a new feature per se. However, it does have a number of changes that have taken place. And one thing I just wanted to highlight here is if you're new to EASM, or even if you're an existing user, this is a very good place to start and to try and identify your higher category risks, or even categorize your risks. When you start with EASM, you may have a lot of data, and this dashboard here, the attack surface dashboard, will help you to define a starting point. So most people will go to this attack surface priorities dashboard and will actually start working on the high severity findings, because those are the ones we categorize as the highest risk and things where you need to fix as urgently as possible. The reason I wanted to highlight this in terms of, when I say it's not a completely new feature, but it is a new feature in terms of some of the intelligence inside, is our findings, our research teams, they are updating this dashboard. So if we find if there is a new finding, there is a new insight, it will be added, either it be a high, a medium, or a low, to this dashboard, and then it's something which we can actually show if you have any assets associated with that finding. So this is something which is worth keeping an eye on. If there are any new insights and you are affected, then obviously you will see those here. And all of this is clickable and you can drill down. So if I click on any of these insights here, it will actually show me a list of all the assets that are affected, and then I can go and remediate and fix those issues. So the insights dashboard is, as I said, one, a valuable source of information and a very good starting point, and two, just gives you all the data at hand very, very quickly, and just makes everything as manageable as possible. The other thing we have is the billable assets. So I know you heard Ajay mention about billable assets there earlier. And actually, I mentioned right at the beginning about the different asset statuses. So billable assets, we have various different asset types. So we have domains, hosts, IP addresses, SSL certs, and who is information contacts. We only look at, in terms of billable assets, approved assets. So we have all these different categories, all these different types of assets, but we will only charge you based on the confident assets, the assets we have high confidence on. And that being said, even though they've been approved, we will only look at the domains, hosts, and IP addresses, and we dedupe those. So you could have a domain which have multiple hosts, and that host could also have the same IP address across all of them. So when I say dedupe, we deduplicate those, and we won't charge you for every single instance of that same IP address. We obviously see that one IP and we charge you for that. So when you compare all your asset count, it's just something to be aware of. We're not charging you for everything. You might have like 10 million assets or 1 million assets. We are deduping, and we're only charging you for approved. And we're also making sure that we only charge you based on the host, domains, and IPs after deduplication. So again, something I wanted to highlight. And there is a billable dashboard which you can click on to see if that changes over time. You can write alerts on that, and you can also check. So maybe you acquire more new infrastructure, or even if you sell it, that will be reflected in the pricing and billing cost. So with that being said, that leads us to our Q&A time. So if there are any specific questions, I'll have a look.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, got you.
Okay. Sorry about that. So the first question is, the new Defender for Cloud CSPM has some benefit around EASM. What exactly is that, and what's the delta between EASM with CSPM and EASM without CSPM?
So we are working through the CSPM. I mean, the two products at the moment CSPM. We're working through that process. They are going to be fairly like for like in terms of what you can do with those products. So, and I think Sushma has some more information on that one. So Sushma,
Yeah.
do you want to take that one?
Sure, absolutely. So on the CSPM side, they are looking at the different assets that can be brought in, but they're not looking very specifically at the externally facing assets. One of the benefits that we have through our integration is that in the CSPM side, for any IP addresses that have been identified in a customer's workspace, CSPM isn't necessarily aware of all of the risk or vulnerability, anything like that associated with that IP address. But we are able to do that correlation and have the customer be identified that for this specific IP address that you see on the CSPM side, we're identifying something on the EASM side that might be of interest to you and you probably should take a look at. So that's the first level of integration that we've done, is to be able to share some of that risk posture information with CSPM regarding specific IP addresses that are externally facing. So there isn't overlap in terms of what the solutions are, but it's more data enrichment and augmentation.
Great, thank you. The next question we have is, what infrastructure will this tool scan? Is it just M365 and Azure environments, or will it scan infrastructure hosted with other cloud providers?
So the EASM will scan everything that's exposed to the internet. So it definitely isn't just a single cloud source or provider. We have the entire internet in our sites as such. So we are scanning everything that's connected to the internet. So yes, the answer is absolutely all infrastructure across the internet. And we are scanning, if you look at EASM or even the infrastructure that sits behind it, it's scanning the entire internet, right? EASM is just taking all of that data and just, I guess, narrowing it down to what's relevant to the customer itself. But yes, the answer is across everything connected to the internet.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how can you make sure only relevant assets show up for organizations that are hosting providers?
So right at the beginning of the presentation, I referred to the seed information as well as our algorithm. So there's two ways which we work through that. So the seeds are very important. So you define as a customer, as a user, where you would like us to go and search. So, and that could be something really simple. It could just be a single domain. And then we'll go out and just discover everything connected to that domain. But we have various different mechanisms of understanding how it's connected to an organization. It could be something as simple as, well, we can see it has a who is record that's associated with that customer. Or we can also go further than that, and we can actually see different connected infrastructure it gets and post. And that's where we have an algorithm which is clever enough to understand if it's related to, let's say, a different entity or an organization. And not just that, it may actually be something that we know is not related to you, but you have a dependency on. So that's another thought and process. So if you have a third party who you are reliant on, you don't own that infrastructure, but it is something you want to you want to know about in as much detail as possible, because you have a heavy reliance. So the algorithm is clever enough. We have some simple checks, we have some more advanced checks. But altogether, the seed information is the important part of that identification.
Great, thank you. The next question is it possible to look for a particular CVE, some kind of threat hunting in EASM itself?
So the seeds will, well, pull in all the different assets associated. And then from there, we have what we call our inventory. So we talked about the dashboards there, and actually we talked about the different saved searches. You could actually identify or search for a specific CVE associated to any of your EASM assets.
Yeah.
So through the inventory, you can identify those.
To put it in other words, you can search your EASM workspace with the CVE ID, and it will give you a list of assets that are affected by it. It is not an intelligence tool, threat intelligence tool just for CVE, for example, but it's more about your digital assets. So, you can search for CVE ID or CVSS scores, and it will give you the list of assets that are affected by it. That's how it works.
Great. And then the final question we have is, I saw a Qualys integration. Can you elaborate on the value versus the overlap on the info provided by both tools?
Right. So the main value, as Michael Lindsay responded, is complementary. EASM discovers unknown assets, everything that is exposed to the internet, everything, which means all on-prem assets, cloud assets, anything else. Anything that's exposed to the internet with a URL, IP addresses, host assets, all of that, SSL, so everything is discovered, and the details, attributes seen from outside. And your vulnerability management program might not have all of those assets included in their program. So this complements that you do all this discovery, you find all these assets, and then feed that to your vulnerability management tool. So it's a complementary solution to a traditionally vulnerable management scanners. And then once we have identified an asset and you fed it to a vulnerability management tool, you can do a deeper scan and include it part of your vulnerability management. So it kind of is a source for your vulnerability management program, which complements, it kind of complements that program. Because
Great.
there's no agent or a scanner. Yeah.
Well, that seems to be all the questions we have for today. So with that, I'd like to thank you, Jamil and Ajay, for being our guests and for sharing the great information with our community. Also, thank you to the Q&A team who helped us with answering the questions and providing the resourceful information. To all the listeners still on the line, if you're someone who wishes to aid in the protection of the world from cyber threats and desire to have a say in shaping our strategies, blueprints, and recommendations, then we invite you to become part of our security community. Together, we can make a global impact. So join us at aka.ms/securitycommunity. This is also where you'll be notified about the upcoming webinars, events, and other announcements. Also, please take a minute submitting your webinar feedback at aka.ms/security-webinar-feedback. For those of you who may have additional questions on the topic we just covered or other product-related questions, please feel free to raise them on our Microsoft Tech Community Discussion Space at aka.ms/Microsoft Defender EASM Community. Thank you all for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye.